Well, it's saying we are live on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn right now. We are back with Consultervations this week with the marvelous Eric Swick. Thanks for coming back, Eric.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. I'm back after being a guest on Friday on Daily Dave, back by absolutely popular demand. I mean, the requests we've been having, Eric, to have Kevin come back and join us again. I mean, my inbox was under siege over the weekend. So responding to that request, here he is with us on Consultervations today. It's quite funny. My phone just alerted me that we're live. That's good, isn't it?
That's good.
So
great to meet you, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're talking about a really important subject, and it's called intentional leadership. And last week we were focused on intentionality on Consultervation. This week I want to talk about intentional leadership. Intentionality is the main theme running through RLC this month. So I want to ask you both, really, from your perspective, what is intentional leadership? You know, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's your map of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, the way I look at it, it's really being cognizant of what you're doing all the time and what impression you're making on your organization in all ways, not just in your actions, not just in your words, but how you treat people and all of that. I think, being truly intentional about everything you do and why you're doing it. Ask yourself that. Why am I acting this way? Or what do I expect to get out of doing something a certain way?
I think you're spot on, because if you're not linking those two parts, you are almost play acting leadership to a degree, aren't you? You're going through emotion.
Well, I think a lot of times too, we all, depending on where you are in life, you've had models, right? You've worked for people over the years, and what I've always done is I've never tried to be exactly like anyone else, but I take all what I consider good qualities from different leaders I've worked with and try to incorporate that into my style.
That's a very good idea. What do you think, Mr. Turnbull?
Well, yeah, I agree with what Eric's saying. I think intentional leadership, there's a deliberateness about it. You're taking specific steps in a deliberate way to lead the organization that you head up. I often talk, to my clients about, what shadow do they cast? What do people think of them in the organization? Not what do you think you are in the organization, but what do you think other people think of you in the organization? And that brings in that whole area of intentionality, because you can change who you are. You can change the shadow that you cast. You can change your personal brand to be other things. And I think to me, that's the nub of this intentionality thing. You can be who you want to be.
I totally agree, Kevin. And I think it's really important for people to be flexible to a degree with their intentionality, so that they can do what you just said and know that if a situation arises the next day, they can be flexible to approach it. What we've been talking about on a blog this week, these 7 RLC leadership principles, and the number 1 is one of the toughest. And then even the image Debbie selected on the blog note was very clear. Model the leadership you want to see. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of secrets to this principle that are really important. One is model the leadership you expect of others tomorrow, today. So that means do it now. Don't wait. Get started. And the other bit says is you do it first. And I believe, and I'd love to know your thoughts, chaps, that asking somebody in this day and age of any generation to do something you don't demonstrate the qualities of, I think it undervalues the request, the delegation, or the coaching that you're doing. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot in that. When I look at my clients' management styles, I'm always struck by the fact that it's often instinctive. Mm-hmm. Yes, Eric, you're right that you do model stuff on people you've come across, leaders that have inspired mm-hmm. you. But a lot of kind of leaders lead by instinct rather than by intention or deliberateness. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to refocus people's mindset into you can be who you want to be by taking intentional steps of leadership. And if you think about who you are, you're going to go from that instinctive side, which is often quite directive, people telling people what to do. So you're acting in a kind of selfish sort of way rather than a selfless way. But it's always surprised me, and I suppose I look back on my career. I never had a coach, and I wish I had. I guess I learned by my own mistakes. I was a C-suite guy for 20 odd years, CEO, blah blah blah, and I'm not sure that I was intentional until I got more experienced, and I did start to think much more deeply about my leadership style and who I was as a leader, if that makes sense.
Well, I agree with what Kevin's saying. I think it's almost like you channel in and out of being intentional and using your instincts. And, sometimes I tend to be a person that processes situations. So I may be in a situation and use my instincts, but then I'll come back and I'll think about, could I have handled that differently? And often I'll go back to that individual and say, you know what? I thought about how I reacted or how I answered your question, and I may correct myself and then be more intentional as opposed to instinctive. So I think it's something that you got to work at all the time. It's not something to be intentional is something that's just natural and you're going to do it every minute of every day. But being aware of it, I think, is the first part of it.
Do you think, though, I know we've had 2020's been harped on about everywhere for all the right reasons primarily, but do you not think that this year needs to be more intentional? Because there's been a lot of slack time last year and stress slack time with lockdowns globally, multiple lockdowns in many countries. Is it not a time to be intentional because you have had the time to sit around and therefore really dig in and focus on even micro personal choices of intentionality as well as business? What do you think?
Well, I think it is important, but I'd say it was just as important through 2020. I mean, I think this is something that people should have been, or leaders should have been doing even through 2020, because this is so unique and different for everyone. And people dealing with emotions that they probably never had to deal with before. Especially in working from home and all the stresses that brought on for people, especially people with families. So I think it's definitely, if you haven't been doing it, you need to be doing it now, because I see the impact it's having on people.
That's right. I think 2020 was you could sum it up in a way by saying that there was a lack of control. Leaders are at home, working from home, and they don't feel fully in control of their organizations because everything seems so remote. But in the real world, the longer this pandemic goes on and the more we're at home, the less that it's harder to get more intentional.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. There are so many things outside of your direct control that you can have good intentions, but whether you follow through on them, I mean, that it's a big ask.
It also creates a space, though, doesn't it? If you were somebody that was commuting 90 minutes to the office, 2 hours plus, both ways, it also creates a level of balance where you can be intentional somewhere else too, can't you? Doing something that isn't your day job or isn't your work. So it creates other opportunities in the short term as well, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rick.
Now, what I was going to say is, what this conversation reminds me of is like Barb Gay, who's usually on these calls with us and couldn't be here today, how every morning at 7:30, she has a call with everyone in her organization. And it's just to touch base and see how they're doing and talk about what are you going to be focused on today. And I think that's a great example of being intentional, where she's reaching out to everyone first thing in the morning. And I think that's a great example of someone that's been doing that from the beginning of this situation.
And it's funny, isn't it? People talk about Bob having implemented a framework in the past, Eric, and working to the principles within the best version business framework. And by the way, if you're watching, wondering what that is, we would all love to talk to you about you building your own one of those. But one of the things that she stuck to was getting that discipline right, which, you know, and for different people, it's different things. But I have to say, a daily check-in doing what you just described is one of the best things a leader could intentionally do. So let's talk about the next one here. So rule number 2, right? So having a story. What do you think this means as you look at it? So traditionally, it's talking about having a shared story you can communicate consistently around your business and around. Often in my research, it also referred to, if you're speaking to marketing, tell it in a marketing way. If you're speaking to finance, tell it, or audit, tell it in their world, to get into their psyche and how you deliver what is still a consistent story. How important do you think this is, chaps, in business right now?
Personally, I think it's fundamental. I think having a story is all about culture. I was talking to one of my coaching clients the other month who was onboarding a new employee. So there's a lesson in this for all of us. And so he bounced off a checklist with me. And it was all technical stuff, you know, paying rations, systems, blah, blah, blah. And I said, where's the story?
Yeah.
You know, who's going to talk about the culture of the organization, what we believe in, and the stories that make that come alive? And to be honest, he looked at me blankly, this guy, as if I was talking in a foreign alien language. And then the penny kind of dropped. And they have gone through the success framework. So they've actually, you know, identified all of these cultural blocks that are part of the organization's story. And he said, you're absolutely right. We need to get the right employees to fit the team, to fit the story, to fit the culture. And it was great. It was great. You know, when you get that penny dropping moment, it's a very positive feedback thing, I think. And he charged away and corrected that omission. So the story is really important.
Yeah.
Also,
go ahead, Dave.
Also, your ability to tell that story, isn't it, as well? Because when you're always commanding, requesting, delegating, initiating, project managing, whatever those ings are, it's always an exchange of just almost raw data, almost neutrality to a degree, or other things can be in play. But when you use storytelling really well, the person can see their space in that story usually because they experience it, which means they can make more sense about what it is you're asking them to create, conceptualize, or even just imagine. So, yeah, great message. Go on, Eric, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what's important in that story is keeping it as simple as possible so that it's easy to communicate. I've seen where, you know, you'll see on a wall a mission statement or a vision statement of some kind, and it's very wordy. And, you know, I often think back to where they always talk about you should have your elevator story. You know, what can you tell people about yourself in 30 seconds? And I think that's important so that you can, it has to be concise and get the point across that you want to get across to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, and it has to be genuine and honest, I think.
Yeah.
I worked for a big multinational early in my career, and in the 80s, you know, it was the thing that companies had to have mission statements and values and all of that sort of stuff. So everyone was given a little, you know, plastic covered card with said mission statement, values, and guiding principles on it, and we all looked at it and said, well, this is rubbish. This is not the culture. You're pretending. And we developed it anyway. Some, you know, organizational development guru working with some director somewhere, but it was false, and therefore the story kind of all fell apart underneath it because no one believed it.
Yeah, we actually developed something that in my firm, and it actually was the employees came up with the idea, and what they did is they took the name SWIC and then had a phrase for each letter of it. I didn't create that. they created it. And so they felt it was theirs. And it was easy then for them to tell that story because it was their own.
There's a lesson, Dave, in leadership. Delegate your storytelling. Delegate your story building.
Yeah.
Totally. But no, but it is, isn't it? I can tell you about a client where they were looking at values definitions, in the framework where we do this, we will and you won't. So you give a value, really great behavioral definition. And this leadership group got together and did it. And they genuinely did a pretty bad job. And there was this nervousness afterwards. Well, how are we going to correct this? Well, we decided to apply what you just said. And we just said, well, listen, tell you what, yeah, you've done a pretty bad job. Why don't we take a selection of your whole organization from every level, put them in a room and give them the same task that you didn't do? Do you know what happened, Kev?
They came up with an authentic story.
Totally, because they're in it. They're in the soup, aren't they? And, I always remember the movie that we're all far too young to remember, Jason and the Argonauts, the pursuit of the golden fleece. And Jason's on his boat, and the Greek gods or whatever they were up in the sky looking down in their little pool of water at what was going on in his life. And sometimes leaders can get caught in that picture where they're not really connected enough to what's going on. Therefore, solving some of these issues is not as easy as it should be, or easy is the wrong phrase. I think straightforward is the intention, isn't it? So, good. Let's talk about number 3, enabling your people to act. Now, I always get 3 and 4 the wrong way around. So if you've read them the other way around in the blog, I apologize. They're exactly the same 2 principles. I might get 3, then 4, then 4, then 3. Either way, though, and I wrote them, that's really ridiculous. But the point it makes in whichever order you do them, as a leader, you can be a CEO of a company or a leader taking over a team for the first time. If you can enable your people to act, do their job better, and this works beautifully with number 4. To show both of them, I'm going to edit this other one and make it a scroll across the bottom of the screen. You'll see how they work together almost straight away, right? So these two just dovetail, don't they?
Yeah.
And if you're, as a leader, spending time removing obstacles, what a brilliant thing to do. Kevin, in your big corporate past and in the big roles you've done before you were, number 1 as opposed to number 2, right? How many times did you see processes created to control rather than free?
Oh, all the time. And the bigger the organization, the more there was of them. Small organizations can be much more flexible and stuff like that. But people who came from big organizations, they had that inflexibility within them as well. I once worked for a company in the kind of security sector, and a lot of the management came from the armed forces. And their position about themselves was, if it's one thing I know, it's about management. And I would respond to them when I was interviewing them. I said, well, let me just pick you up on that one, because the one thing you don't know is management. You're used to a directive, controlling management style, which is increasingly inappropriate in the private sector. So let's talk that through. And so that was always a good example of a directive style which is based around systems and procedures, which frankly doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't, does it? And I think you're absolutely right. There is a need, isn't there, to do a much better job at this. And when you just start to look at some of these 3 as they stack together, some of these are actually genuinely stretching. So asking a leader to change the way they are thinking about their leadership, for example, even by a small degree, can almost seem alien to them. Yet what we're talking about here is prioritizing enabling people to take action, but we're also talking about spending your time removing things. I remember working with this client in the northeast of England where they had an awful difficult job. They were responsible. They were the department responsible for, when someone dies, you've got the death certificate and you've got to activate all the afterlife services and the will payout in particularly. And you go through a 28-day process, right? whilst you're grieving, to go from point of death when you call them, it might be a day or two after, dealing with the affairs, and it would take 7 weeks and multiple touch points to resolve matters. And the leadership suddenly realized we need to make that as short as possible. They got it down to 7 days, which I think is respectable, right? I think they've actually had incidents where they've done it in 3 days, Kevin, right? So particularly when it's a medically induced death that you knew was coming, right? So cancer or something like that, where, I've even seen some of these clients pay out beforehand these days when death is inevitable. But they're taking a painful situation, Eric, and going, this is really bad.
Mm-hmm.
We are delivering a clunky service at a really sensitive time. And I mean, kudos to this client who did that. Who'd want to fix that as an intervention? But it's a perfect example of removing obstacles that are in the path of the people that you're leading or serving, isn't it?
Yeah. I often think about when it comes to enabling your people to act is that you have to communicate that it's okay to make mistakes.
Yep.
As long as your intentions are right and you're trying to do something positive, you learn from that. And
Yep.
I can remember my very first boss telling me something similar to that I'm okay with you coming and asking me questions because you're in a learning phase. You're new and you're learning. You just got to be there to support them and make sure they know it's safe to take risks.
Yeah, I often talk about, when I have a client who's a leader, I ask them about their leadership style, and I almost always introduce the whole notion of, the leader as a servant, which is all about removing obstacles from the path of your people, and so on. And I just illustrate it by saying, leaders of old, the Winston Churchills of the world, they were very directive, giving orders essentially. And which for Churchill was probably very appropriate in a wartime. But in modern times, where people are more engaged or more switched off, depending which point of view you have, taking the view that the leader is a servant, i.e., going to your people and say, "What can I do to make your job easier?" Which is the same thing as saying, "What can I do to make you more productive?" But can I remove any red tape or bureaucracy? Can I give you more freedom to think? That is the modern day leadership style, which chimes very well with younger generations.
Yes. Yeah. I find the word that comes to my mind all the time is trust. And I think that, if you're not a leader that trusts your people and your organization to do the right thing, then you're probably not in the right role. And that's what you got to work on. And, I think it starts from, who you bring, you talked about earlier, who you bring into your organization, right? If they are of the right mind and they share the same values and, you have developed that culture, then you have to trust them to do the right thing.
I love it. Two very strong messages. Kevin, asking the right question. Eric, building and having trust in advance. In the world of academia, I once met several professors who actually said every student comes into my classroom with 100% pass rate. Right? What we do between now and when they actually take the exam is work out what the most realistic score is of their ability. So they could stay at 100. But it's a good mindset, isn't it? It's not the answer to everything we've got to deal with today, but it's just a good reminder. Let's take a look at this one then. How important is this in 2021? And the assumption is it should have been important in 2020. How vital do you think this is right now today?
Well, I think it's more relevant than ever. When I talk to clients about what they're doing about communications internally in the COVID era, a lot of them initially stood back and said, "Well, what does that mean?"
Yeah.
You explain about working from home and so on and so forth. It's tough. And I had a CEO client who beautifully got this. Because he didn't just start kind of more frequent town halls and one-on-ones, but he was very deliberate in identifying single people in the organization who were working from home, where the weekend can seem like an eternity because they're not talking to anybody. So he would arrange pizza deliveries on a Friday night to say that, you know, we love you, we care about you, we respect you. It's a difficult time, but we're in this together. And he was developing that heart of the organization in a very proactive, employee-centric sort of a way, people-centric.
Yeah, you know, what I think about, Dave, is when they ever do these surveys about, you know, what's most important to you to get from your employer, and, you know, compensation's always way down on the list, but the top thing typically is, I just want to know that my employer cares about me, that, you know, they're in this for me as well, making sure that I progress, that I grow, that I, you know, develop additional skills. To me, if that's what the people want, that's what you got to deliver, and that's where, you know, encouraging the heart of the organization is critical.
I love both your perspectives because they are both intelligent, they're both thought through action. And I think the slant I'll take to support both your concepts and your principles around how you've answered this is really simple. For me, it's a lens. You either look through it or you don't. And I think a leader is responsible for, even go back to principle number 1 today, RLC rule number 1 about modeling, is responsible for encouraging even through the truth. You know, I've seen great leaders go through uncertain times, be really raw and authentic, but with a tint of inspiration, so that they're not masking how perilous it is, but they're also not hiding it. And therefore, that level of authentic message, coupled with great skill, particularly, gets people to go, no, we're not letting this happen. You know, I remember one client who was going into receivership, and it was stopped by the pure will of the CEO, who said no to the lenders for 3 days in lockdown meetings and managed to get a lifeline, which ultimately, on behalf of the colleagues, is exactly the right thing to do, isn't it? When you're in that chair. And therefore, that was built on truth, peril, hope, and inspiration. Now, that's not a formula, by the way. You don't have to put peril into your communication strategy tomorrow, but it's relevant to the conversation, isn't it? And I think this is one of the most important secrets that's not a secret that we all forget to do enough of. You know, I met with Colette Bell today, who's, you know, is a real friend, sponsor, support to RLC globally. And before we were done, I made sure I shared some self-wood because I hadn't seen her for ages. And actually her instant impact in the conversation was genuinely wonderful. And I don't believe you should be assumptive about that, because one day it might not be. So just letting her know that impact of that today was wonderful, as it takes 2 seconds to do, doesn't it? Yeah. And what it isn't, and some people try to do it this way, it's not saying well done for what you did today, you know, because that really is, so what? It is that bit extra, isn't it? As Debbie wrote about last week, soul food, genuine, positive, specific. Yep. Say it, write it, give it, you know, it's all intentional. And that's the difference, I think, that we're talking about today. And act you do deliberately with leadership. Now, pop quiz, gentlemen. We'll finish the other leadership principles next week, because we want to talk about well-being too. If you had to go and do leadership tomorrow, what is the most common answer clients give you?
Mean answer to the question about leadership?
Yeah, how do you go and do leadership?
Yeah.
What's the common client answer, do you think?
Well, I've gotten all different types of answers, but I think probably the most common is, you know, helping set direction.
Totally, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's normally,
I hear a lot about that. You know, my role is to set the direction, set the tone. I have one client that every year he comes up with kind of a catchphrase of what he wants to focus on for the year. The problem with that is it's his, and it's not the organization's, but he always does something like that. And so, you know, that's what I think most people think leadership is let's set direction. What are the goals for this year?
Good show. Before we go to Kevin, let me give you the most classic senior manager wants to be a director ambition statement I've ever heard. Are you ready, Kev? I bet you've heard this millions of times, right? Yeah, I just want to be involved in more strategic things or a strategic role. Translated means you don't want to do any work. You just want to tell people to do the work. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
It does sound very familiar.
It does, yeah. Anyway, Kev, what do you think the answer is? The number one answer to how do you do leadership?
Well, I think there are. I mean, I've heard many answers to that, and the majority have been wrong. Because a lot of people, identify leadership with being the kind of keeper of the numbers, the keeper of hard success points, achieving this and achieving that goals, number of widgets made, whatever it is. But Eric, you're absolutely right. It's the real answer. The real answer goes back to this whole conundrum of working in the business and on the business. Working operationally and working strategically, looking up and setting the vision and the goals and the direction of the company. A lot of people don't do it, because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. It's hard. It's like the success of the success framework is that it makes a hard job much more simple.
It does.
And because all of that strategic stuff and, going from the granular goal setting for the next 24 months to the strategic, what are the cornerstones of my business and why are they important? That requires a bit of deep thought. Yeah. And that's why people find leadership quite hard, because they can't say, it's too much like hard work. I'll get back to managing.
Yeah, that's so true, Kevin. I mean, as you say that, I'm picturing all different clients that fit that mold. And you're right, it is hard work. And they tend to get focused more on working in the business than on it.
Right.
So, would you like to know the RLC answer?
Sure.
Oh, yes, please, Dave.
Thanks, Kevin. Leadership is coaching. Leadership coaching. And what we like to do is we like to dismantle this. If you're listening or watching, we like to dismantle this whole idea of leadership. That leadership itself is how you model the right leadership you're expecting of others. Rule number one, down the center. As simple things. Are you getting your mindset right? Are you doing what you talk about? Are you walking the walk you say? Do people believe you? Keep it nice and short and simple. Mm-hmm. Coaching is you putting your focus into the people you've chosen to lead. Applying these leadership rules, removing obstacles, building skill, building beliefs, building the story, Kevin, from earlier, build the culture. Actively going out of your way to coach, cajole, and nurture, mentor your people. What do you think?
Absolutely. Agree.
Wisdom, Dave, wisdom.
Okay.
And you know what you just said there, it strikes a frequently seen chord in my life. It's the sense of asking. It's getting people to do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah,
which can be quite challenging. I know I have some clients where we go through a coaching session, and it's all very positive, and then they switch the Zoom off and they go back and do the things that the way they've always done it.
Yeah.
And then I revisit it and I try and get it written down into goals and intentionality and all of that sort of stuff. And many a time people said, I haven't really done much about that. And so I say, it wasn't a goal then, you were just pretending.
Yeah.
If you don't action it, it was never a goal.
Yeah.
You're just giving some bullshit about, what you should do, but not what you're going to do.
Well, and I believe that sometimes they believe it. It's just no one's holding them accountable. So if no one's holding you accountable, it's very easy to just say, yeah, I'll get to that. And I deal with, the immediate things that are in front of me right now, as opposed to, being more strategic.
That's why people need a coach for accountability.
I believe in it.
Go on, Eric.
No, I believe in that. I believe exactly what Kevin said.
Well, as I said earlier, I never had a coach in my executive career, and I look back with regret because I wish I had.
Yeah.
I didn't have to be on my own making mistakes. And I was pretty good at what I did, Don't get me wrong. So I didn't make that many mistakes, but I look back and think I struggled making that decision. I struggled with these things, and I had no one to kind of bounce ideas off, to be held accountable for what I'm doing. And I'm sure I would have been much more productive by a factor of 25% if I'd had a kind of coach and mentor working with me in some pretty challenging jobs that I did.
Yeah.
So you've been listening to Consultervation. Today we have been talking to Kevin Turnbull, who's the VP of Consult, our program for training coaches and giving you the tools to build your practice, and the president of RLCLA. That's a posh title, Kevin. Who's been with me talking with Eric Swick from Swick Business Strategies, also a member of our RLC Legacy team, about the RLC leadership principles and how relevant they are to today in 2021 as they've always been. And an interesting fact is, if you're listening, these 7 leadership principles, you can get them on www.rlc-global.com/blog, and the latest blog from this week. I always used to say when I introduced them, Kevin and Eric, you can take these to the bank. If you build a career out of doing these 7 things, we've done 5 in this episode, you can almost just say, listen, it's going to work, because these are many of the things people are looking to hear, listen, and take action about in your company. Join us again next week. I know Eric and Kevin are back. We'll do more of these leadership principles. We hope to hear from our other friends about how they actually do it in operation inside their client-focused businesses. And if you're listening to Consultervation, you may as well join us on Double D Do Business too, and listen to some more terrific conversations we're having in different formats with people from all over the world. Listen, Kevin and Eric, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. It was a great conversation.